The first impression of the Forbidden City, at least from the outside, was always one of glory. Walls stretched in red magnificence, gilded rooftops shimmered under the sun, and ceremonial gates looked as if they had been brushed by the hands of heaven itself. Travelers from distant lands who approached the capital often wrote in their diaries that they had never seen anything so vast, so ordered, or so dazzling in their lives. Yet within this fortress of ceremony and splendor, there existed another world, hidden and rarely spoken of aloud. It was the world of the Imperial concubines, women who entered behind those gates believing they were stepping into the golden heart of China, but who quickly discovered that beneath the painted surface lay a place of shadows, discomfort, and filth. For the young girl chosen to enter the harem, the journey began with excitement wrapped in trembling fear. She had been plucked from her family, perhaps from a modest courtyard home in the provinces, perhaps from a household of minor officials. No matter her origin, her fate had been sealed when the imperial selection passed through her town. She would be scrubbed, powdered, and dressed in silk she had never imagined wearing before, led into a hall of examination where her posture, her teeth, and even the whiteness of her skin were appraised like the quality of porcelain. If chosen, she was carried away, sometimes with pride, sometimes with tears, but always with finality. Few ever returned home. The palace was both a dream and a prison, and the girl had no say in which side of that coin would dominate her life. As her litter crossed the palace threshold, the sensory shock could be overwhelming. There were lanterns, fluttering banners, courtyards stretching like endless puzzles of stone, and the heavy scent of incense hanging in the air. Yet as she was led deeper, she noticed small cracks in the illusion. The courtyard smelled faintly of urine, where eunuchs relieved themselves in the corners. Rats darted quickly across the narrow corridors where the shadows lingered. Walls that gleamed from afar showed patches of mildew when observed up close. And for the girl who had dreamed of eternal fragrance, there was instead a cloying mix of perfumes covering odors too stubborn to vanish entirely. Her assigned quarters were not the golden chambers that painters later loved to depict. Instead, she was shown into a cramped room shared with other new concubines, the plaster damp from the last rainfall, the bedding thin and rough despite its embroidered cover. A painted screen hid a chamber pot, the only relief for dozens of women, emptied by low-ranking maids who often spilled more than they carried. At night, when the palace lanterns dimmed, the stench crept in without mercy. The girl pressed her sleeve to her nose, realizing with unease that what had been described to her as the pinnacle of civilization was, in truth, a place where filth clung stubbornly to every surface. Still, she tried to focus on the promise whispered in the villages, that a concubine could become an empress if fortune favored her, that her family could rise in rank, and that her own face might one day appear in paintings preserved for centuries. Such dreams kept many of the women quiet during those first disorienting nights. They tried to ignore the scratching of insects in the corners, the lice in the bedding, or the queasy feeling when food was delivered in bowls that smelled faintly of rot. They told themselves that this was simply the beginning, that once the emperor noticed them, life would improve. But the emperor noticed few and favored fewer still. For most, the dream ended before it had truly begun. The atmosphere of the harem was not filled with music and poetry, as romantic novels would later suggest, but with sighs, quarrels, and whispers. Women fought not only for affection, but for clean water, for softer bedding, even for scraps of food when supplies ran short. The kitchens of the palace could prepare feasts for grand banquets. Yet for the concubines, meals often arrived late, cold, or stale. The smell of mold clung to the rice. Meat was greasy, served in chipped dishes, carried by tired eunuchs who sometimes spat in the broth out of resentment. To complain was dangerous, yet to eat was unavoidable. The girl learned to swallow her meals quickly, without looking too closely, and to thank heaven for every day she did not fall ill. The promise of refinement, The endless lessons in poetry, calligraphy, and music soon revealed its darker side as well. While she sat in dim chambers, practicing brushstrokes, fleas bit her ankles. While she plucked the strings of a lute, the air was thick with the odor of unwashed bodies pressed too closely together. Clean water was rationed, baths rare, and perfumes became a necessity not of beauty, but of survival. A concubine's body was supposed to be a vessel of allure, yet in truth, it was constantly under siege by grime, infection, and exhaustion. She dabbed her wrists with scented oils, not for seduction, but to mask the stench of the chamber pot only feet away. At night, lying on her thin bedding, the girl would hear distant echoes of drums, bells, and rituals that spoke of the emperor's divine order. But inside her small room, another rhythm prevailed, the sound of women coughing in the dark, of rats gnawing at the edges of the wooden floor, of muffled sobs hidden under sleeves. She realized she was not alone in her disillusionment, that almost every woman around her had once believed in the myth of imperial beauty, only to discover the filthy truth. It was a truth rarely spoken, because to speak it aloud was to admit defeat, and in the palace, defeat was as dangerous as ambition. Thus began her life behind the painted gates, a life that would stretch in years of waiting, enduring, and surviving. The filth was not only in the air or on the floor, it seeped into the soul, corroding hope, transforming laughter into bitterness. And yet, she clung to the faint possibility that something might change, that a single knight summoned by the emperor might rewrite her story. It was this fragile hope, mixed with unbearable filth, that defined the secret, hidden existence of the imperial concubine. The road to the palace was lined with expectation, yet beneath that expectation lay fear. For most young women, the imperial draft was not a choice, but a summons. Families often whispered with both pride and dread when their daughter was of age. They knew the opportunities that might follow if she were chosen, but they also knew that once she passed beyond the Vermilion gates, their child would not belong to them anymore. She would belong to the court, to the emperor, and to a life dictated by rules harsher than any village elder could imagine. Every few years, the selection process unfurled like a theater production. Imperial officials spread through the provinces, sending word that girls of suitable age, appearance, and family background should be presented for consideration. The announcement stirred entire communities. Mothers hurried to prepare their daughters, bleaching their faces with powders, feeding them broth to keep the complexion pale, trimming their nails and drilling them on etiquette. Fathers boasted or fretted depending on their fortunes, some seeing the draft as the possibility of honor, others fearing that it would mean losing their beloved child to a gilded prison. The examinations themselves were merciless. In grand halls set aside for the purpose, rows of trembling girls stood before stern-faced officials. Every feature was assessed. Skin was examined for blemishes, teeth checked for cleanliness, posture observed with scrutiny. A stoop, a scar, even a hint of clumsiness could mean instant rejection. The officials looked not for joy or wit, but for blank perfection, the sort of beauty that could be molded, displayed, and commanded. Many of the girls were no more than 14 or 15, still unsteady in their own bodies, yet required to bow, kneel, and present themselves like seasoned courtiers. For those who passed, the first taste of imperial life was paradoxical. New robes of silk that scratched the skin, unfamiliar shoes that pinched their toes, powdered faces that stung with each layer. They were grouped together, herded almost like cattle, and informed that from this day forward, they would be trained in palace manners and that their former lives were behind them. Their laughter, their dialects, their habits, all were stripped away, replaced by the language of the court, by the subtle bow of the head, and the careful arrangement of their eyes so that they never lingered too long on a superior. The journey into the Forbidden City itself was overwhelming. The girls traveled in curtained litters, unable to see more than flashes of the streets, Yet even those brief glimpses revealed the widening gulf between the world they had known and the one they were entering. Outside, markets bustled with noisy hawkers selling roasted chestnuts and dumplings. Children darted between stalls, and farmers hauled carts of greens. Inside the gates, silence fell heavy, broken only by the shuffle of eunuchs and the distant call of bells. No child's laughter rang here. Instead, there was the hush of ceremony, the stern eyes of guards, the echo of sandals on endless stone paths. When the newly selected concubines were first shown their quarters, many felt a pang of disappointment they dared not voice. They had been promised the palace of jade and gold, yet their assigned rooms smelled of dampness. The walls cracked from years of neglect. Bedding was thin, often recycled from women who had slept there before them, leaving behind the faint smell of sweat that no perfume could fully erase. Insects scuttled across the floor at night. The glamour of the Forbidden City quickly revealed itself as a carefully maintained surface, beneath which decay and filth clung stubbornly. Still, the hope of rising in rank sustained them. Palace tutors instructed the girls in poetry, song, and dance, urging them to become flawless ornaments in the emperor's court. Each movement was corrected, each mistake punished with humiliation. Yet beyond the lessons, there was no true path laid out. Everything depended on whether the emperor noticed them, and he rarely noticed more than a handful. For every favored concubine, there were dozens left to languish in obscurity, living half-lives of waiting, growing bitter with each passing year. The bitterness was sharpened by the constant awareness of rank. The hierarchy within the harem was as rigid as the imperial bureaucracy outside. At the top was the empress, beneath her the imperial consorts, then the consorts, the concubines, the attendants, and on downward through a dozen titles that determined everything from how much food was allotted to whether one's lamps were lit at night. A single misstep before a superior could earn lashes or confinement. Even the lowest maid could turn informant, whispering words that destroyed reputations in an instant. In this world, silence was safer than honesty, and smiles were often masked for rivalry. The filth of the palace was not only physical but moral. Girls learned quickly that survival required cunning. They witnessed others smearing rivals with accusations of disrespect, planting lice in a betting roll to suggest uncleanliness, or whispering that another had spoken ill of the empress. Punishments were swift. A girl might be stripped of her silks, forced into coarse garments, and confined in a damp cell where rats scurried at her feet. Others were sent back to their families in disgrace, a fate worse than death for those whose villages now saw them as tainted by imperial rejection. For the young concubine who had only recently crossed the painted gates, the selection process seemed less like a crowning honor and more like a bitter initiation. The promise of grandeur had soured quickly, leaving her with the undeniable sense that she had been deceived. She was surrounded by jewels and silk, yet the jewels cut and the silk chafed. She was told she was fortunate beyond measure, yet her stomach turned at the sight of spoiled rice. Her ears rang with the cries of women punished for mistakes as small as a misplaced bow. And yet, even amid the filth and cruelty, hope lingered. Every concubine carried within her the flickering dream that she might be the chosen one, the woman lifted from obscurity to glory by a single glance from the emperor. It was this cruel balance of despair pressed close against desire that trapped them all. The palace was not a world of pure suffering nor of pure luxury, but a place where both coexisted, twisting around each other like vines choking the same tree. In time, the girl would realize that the bitter beginning was not a passing stage, but the very essence of her new life. The selection was not the opening of a door to beauty, but the sealing of a gate to freedom. She had entered willingly, even proudly, yet she now understood that what awaited her was less a future of honor and more a test of endurance against filth, rivalry, and unending uncertainty. The painted gates had closed behind her, and they would not open again. The architecture of the Forbidden City was designed to awe. From above, it was a labyrinth of symmetry, with gates aligned to cosmic principles, courtyards arranged like measured breaths, and golden tiles glimmering as though the very heavens had spilled their wealth upon Beijing. To the outside world, this was the seat of the Son of Heaven, the most powerful man alive, whose court radiated order, majesty, and unbroken control. Yet for the women who lived within the harem, the palace was less a symbol of glory and more a cage gilded too heavily for its bars to be noticed from afar. They called it a place of splendor, but for those inside, it was a prison in every sense of the word. When the young concubine first realized she could not leave, it was not through chains or guards, but through absence. She looked out upon the vast courtyards and saw no streets beyond. Her life had shrunk to a series of courtyards within courtyards, each locked by another gate, each watched by another eunuch. There was no river flowing by, no hills in the distance, no sound of village chatter, no marketplace cries, no freedom to walk beyond the painted walls. Even the sky, when glimpsed between tiled eaves, seemed smaller, confined as though heaven itself had been reduced to narrow strips of light. Daily life within these confines carried an odd mixture of monotony and tension. At dawn, bells struck to signal the waking of the palace. Concubines rose quickly, for lateness was noted and punishable. They washed in shallow basins of water, cold and often dirty, shared among several women. Clean water was rationed, drawn from wells that grew stagnant in summer and icy in winter. Some concubines dabbed themselves with perfume-soaked cloths rather than attempt a full wash, masking unwashed skin with layers of sandalwood or musk. The result was a confusing blend of scents, flowers, oils, sweat, and mildew that clung to the chambers like an unwelcome ghost. Their quarters were never as luxurious as later paintings suggested. Though silks draped the walls and carved screens offered the illusion of refinement, cracks in the plaster revealed dampness, vermin nested in the shadows, and rats gnawed at stored grain in the night. The bedding, embroidered with imperial motifs, was still thin against the chill of northern winters, and lice crawled across seams despite endless attempts at fumigation. A chamber pot in the corner, hastily emptied each morning, left behind an odor that even incense could not smother. The irony was cruel. The very palace said to embody civilization often smelled little better than a stable. Meals were carried in by eunuchs, steaming bowls placed upon low tables. The first sight of lacquered trays and porcelain bowls seemed luxurious, but closer inspection revealed reality. Rice often clumped, damp from improper storage. Vegetables wilted before they reached the table. Meat, greasy and sometimes slightly spoiled, floated in broth that had traveled too long from the kitchens. Food was distributed by rank, the higher concubines receiving fresher dishes, while those of lower standing accepted what was left, their chopsticks hesitating as they wondered if the grease would sour their stomachs by nightfall. Yet hunger was more dangerous than illness, so most ate quickly, swallowing without complaint, whispering prayers that their bodies would endure. The air of imprisonment was intensified by rules that dictated every gesture. A concubine could not wander freely. She was assigned a courtyard, and straying beyond it required permission. She could not speak directly to the emperor unless summoned. She could not address the empress without bowing low, eyes downcast, words carefully chosen. Even in leisure, the women were not free. They were expected to embroider, recite poetry, or practice music under the supervision of attendants who reported back to higher authorities. Privacy did not exist. Letters from home were censored if they were allowed at all. Some women spent years without word from their families, as though they had been erased from their past lives entirely. Filth crept into the soul as much as the body. The confinement bred suspicion, and suspicion bred cruelty. Women whispered of rivals, schemed for the emperor's notice, or prayed for the downfall of those above them in rank. Friendships existed, but they were fragile, often broken by betrayal. A confidant could one day be a rival if fortune shifted, Trust was a luxury no one could afford, and thus many concubines learned to wear polite smiles even when their hearts churned with envy and resentment. At night, the silence was never complete. The concubine heard the rustle of vermin, the muffled sobs of women who cried into their sleeves, the coughs of those ill with fevers that spread quickly in damp quarters. Occasionally, distant laughter echoed from the chambers of a favored consort, a reminder that while some lived in despair, others bathed in rare privilege. The young concubine lay awake, staring at the wooden beams above her, wondering which fate would be hers. Was she destined to vanish into obscurity, or might she one day be called to the emperor's side, lifted from squalor into temporary grace? Imprisonment within splendor carried another cruelty, the contrast between beauty and decay. She could walk through a hall of painted dragons, their scales shimmering in lacquered brilliance, and yet trip over a cracked tile where weeds grew stubbornly. She could gaze upon porcelain vases imported from far provinces, only to smell the rancid odor wafting from the chamber pot nearby. The palace was a paradox, a place where magnificence and filth lived side by side, each making the other more unbearable. To the outside world, the forbidden city was paradise. To the women within, it was a cage whose bars were painted gold. And so she endured. Each day was measured not in freedom, but in survival. Enduring the smells, enduring the dampness, enduring the endless wait for recognition. Every sunrise was another reminder that she had entered a prison disguised as splendor, and every sunset whispered that she might never escape it. The true filth of the harem was not only the dirt that clung to its chambers, but the despair that sank slowly into the hearts of its captives. In the palace, rank was everything. It was not simply a matter of honorific titles or ceremonial distinctions, but a force that dictated how one ate, where one slept, how one walked, even how one breathed within the forbidden city. A concubine might wake each morning to find that her entire existence, her food, her clothing, her dignity, was determined not by her character nor by her intelligence, but by the fragile, shifting label assigned to her in the imperial hierarchy. At the very top was the empress, a figure both revered and feared. She was the wife of the emperor in name and rank, mistress of the harem, an arbiter of every dispute that arose among the women. Below her were the imperial consorts, then the consorts, and descending downward through the concubines, attendants, and the numerous lesser titles that filled the ranks of the harem like grains of rice in a bowl. The system was a pyramid, and each step down the structure meant a step closer to invisibility. Those at the lowest levels were often little more than glorified servants, their voices silenced, their presence ignored. The tyranny of rank manifested in the smallest details of daily life. A high-ranking consort's quarters might be furnished with polished wood, painted screens, and attendants trained to anticipate her slightest gesture. Her meals arrived in porcelain bowls, steaming and freshly prepared, with meats carefully carved and fruits washed in clean water. A lesser concubine, by contrast, might receive the same dish hours later, when the broth had grown cold, the rice clumped, and the vegetables soggy. Even the utensils carried significance. Ivory chopsticks for the favored, wooden ones for the forgotten. Bathing, too, was governed by rank. The empress and her consorts had regular access to heated baths, perfumed with oils and attended by eunuchs who scrubbed every inch of their bodies with care. Lower women were left to shallow basins of water, sometimes shared between several concubines, the liquid gray with use by the time it reached the last. To be of low rank was not only to be deprived of comfort, but to be condemned to filth, forced to live in a cycle of inadequate washing, stale perfumes, and constant discomfort. Even clothing betrayed one's place in the hierarchy. The upper women wore silks embroidered with phoenixes and peonies, while the lower ranks were given garments already faded from use, with stitches unraveling at the hems. A concubine could be shamed for appearing in a robe too fine for her station, for such a display was considered an affront to those above her. And yet, appearing too shabby carried its own risks, for the emperor might dismiss her as unworthy of attention. Navigating these expectations became an exhausting dance, one where every thread and every fold of fabric carried the weight of judgment. Punishments for violating the rules of rank were swift and merciless. A misplaced bow, a word spoken out of turn, or an accidental glance into the eyes of a superior could bring humiliation or worse. Some were forced to kneel for hours on cold stone until their knees bled. Others were struck with bamboo rods or confined to dark, damp chambers where rats scurried across their feet. The higher one climbed, the greater the danger became, for envy burned hottest at the top. A consort might be accused of arrogance or of plotting against the empress, and such accusations, whether true or false, could end in ruin. For the newly arrived concubine, the rigid ladder of rank was bewildering at first. She had grown up in a village where her family name mattered, where respect was owed to elders, but where she could still laugh freely, run in the fields, or speak without fear of transgression. Here, a single step in the wrong courtyard could mark her as disrespectful. A single gesture made at the wrong angle could destroy her chance at favor. The palace was not only a prison of walls, but of rules, each one sharp as a blade, each capable of cutting her down without warning. The cruelty of rank was compounded by the constant reminder that advancement was rare. A concubine's standing depended almost entirely on whether the emperor called her to his chambers. If he favored her, her rank rose, her rooms expanded, her food improved. If he ignored her, she languished in obscurity, her beauty fading, her garments fraying, her health declining. A woman could wait years without being summoned, her life reduced to embroidery, gossip, and the slow decay of hope. For many, the harem was less a place of opportunity than a waiting room for death, a place where the young grew old behind painted walls while the world outside forgot them. The filth of the hierarchy was not only in the physical deprivation it caused, but in the way it corroded the spirit. Women who might have been kind sisters, gentle daughters, or beloved wives in another life were turned into rivals, forced to claw at each other for the slightest advancement. They poisoned each other's meals, spread rumors, and sabotaged clothing, anything to gain a step upward on the ladder. Rank dictated survival, and survival demanded cruelty. At night, when the palace lay in darkness, the concubine would reflect on the absurdity of it all. The emperor, in whose name all this structure existed, was a distant figure, a man she might never meet, yet his unseen presence ruled every breath she took. She lived not for herself, but for a chance that he might glance in her direction, call her by name, and lift her from the filth of obscurity. Until then, she remained bound by the tyranny of rank, trapped in a system where every luxury was tinged with decay, and every rule carried the weight of despair. In this way, the Forbidden City revealed its cruelest secret, that even within splendor, filth and suffering could thrive, not because of neglect, but because of design. The system itself was built to oppress, to divide, and to ensure that the women within the palace never forgot their place. It was not the golden rooftops that defined the imperial harem, but the invisible chains of rank that bound each woman to her misery. The Forbidden City was often imagined as a place where every detail gleamed with perfection, where courtyards were swept until the stones shone, where incense burned without pause, and where the wealth of the empire poured like an endless river into the lap of its master. But for those who lived inside its walls, especially the concubines, the truth was stranger and in many ways filthier. The palace was not only a world of silks and pearls, it was a place where waste piled up as swiftly as luxury, where the very economy of daily life carried the stench of decay. The harem was vast, housing hundreds of women and thousands of attendants. Feeding, clothing, and maintaining such a multitude required endless supplies, endless servants, and endless movement of goods. Each day, carts rolled through the palace gates carrying vegetables, sacks of rice, jars of oil, bundles of cloth, and firewood. At first, the concubine might have thought this constant flow of abundance proof of the emperor's greatness. Yet she quickly learned how much of it was tainted by corruption, neglect, and rot. Food, for instance, passed through many hands before it reached her table. Farmers delivered produce at the outer markets, where eunuchs inspected and bargained. By the time the vegetables reached the kitchens, many had spoiled from the long journey. Rice, stored in damp granaries, often sprouted with insects. Meat, slaughtered far outside the city, arrived in barrels already turning sour. Yet none of this halted the system. The spoiled food was boiled, salted, or spiced, dressed up in porcelain bowls and presented as if it were a feast. Those of highest rank received the freshest portions. Those below ate what remained. By the time a concubine of modest standing lifted her chopsticks, the broth might be lukewarm, the rice crawling with weevils too small to pick out, the taste masked with overpowering sauces. Cleanliness in such a system was almost impossible. The kitchens themselves were noisy, crowded places where eunuchs and maids hurried to prepare hundreds of meals at once. The air was heavy with smoke and grease, and flies circled lazily above uncovered dishes. Wastewater pooled in corners, drawing insects and rats. The smell clung to everything: trays, bowls, and the very hands of the servants who carried the food. For the women waiting in their chambers, there was no choice but to accept whatever arrived, bowing politely to the eunuchs who delivered it, and then swallowing quickly, praying not to fall ill. Clothing, too, revealed the strange economy of filth. At first, the concubine marveled at the robes issued to her: silks embroidered with flowers, belts adorned with tassels, and slippers sewn with delicate thread. Yet after a few weeks, she began to notice the truth. The garments were not always new. Many were recycled, passed down from higher-ranked women to those below. A robe once worn by a favored consort might eventually make its way to a lesser concubine, its colors faded, its seams frayed, and its fabric carrying the faint scent of another's perfume mixed with sweat. What was presented as luxury was, in reality, a cycle of hand-me-downs, a constant reminder that even beauty carried the mark of decay. The palace itself consumed and discarded goods at a staggering pace. Carpets grew moldy in the damp northern air. Bedding filled with lice was burned and replaced, yet the infestation always returned. Perfumes, imported at great cost, were poured over chamber pots to mask the smell of human waste, their sweetness mingling grotesquely with stench. Even objects of refinement, jade cups, painted fans, lacquered screens, could not escape the slow creep of filth. Dust settled on them within hours, and insects chewed at their edges. Servants tried to keep up, but the sheer scale of the palace made perfection impossible. Splendor was always shadowed by grime. The economy of the harem was also one of power. Eunuchs controlled the flow of goods, and with control came corruption. They skimmed rice from the sacks, sold silks at secret markets, and demanded bribes from concubines who wished for better food or fresher water. A woman who offered a jewel or a promise might receive fruit still ripe, while another, too poor or too proud to bargain, might be left with wilted leaves and broken bowls. Thus, filth became another tool of hierarchy, a punishment for the powerless, a privilege for those who could pay. The concubine learned to stretch her limited resources with quiet ingenuity. She dried orange peels to scent her bedding, scattered mint leaves to chase away insects, and stitched torn garments by candlelight. She whispered to sympathetic maids, offering them trinkets in exchange for scraps of soap or an extra ladle of rice. Survival in the palace was not about grace or talent, but about learning to navigate the economy of decay, where every necessity came at a hidden cost. At night, when the kitchens quieted and the halls fell still, the remnants of this economy revealed themselves most starkly. Rats crept out to feast on forgotten scraps. their teeth scratching audibly against wood. The smell of rot drifted from storage rooms, mingling with incense smoke that had burned too long. The palace that seemed so golden in the sunlight was, by darkness, little different from a slum, its grandeur reduced to the groans of vermin and the stink of waste. And yet outside the palace walls, the world still believed in the illusion. Envoys from distant lands described halls gleaming with riches, ceremonies that dazzled the senses, and women adorned like goddesses. They never saw the gray water in which the concubines washed, the stale rice they swallowed, or the lice that bit their ankles as they practiced courtly bows. They recorded what they were allowed to see, and what they saw was magnificence. The filth remained hidden, secret, and unspoken, an invisible economy that governed the lives of those who had no power to escape it. For the concubine, the realization was slow but unrelenting. The palace was not a world of purity. It was a world where splendor and decay coexisted, where every jewel was set against a background of dirt, where every fragrance covered a stench, and where every promise of luxury carried within it the taste of rot. The filth was not an accident, but a foundation, a hidden economy upon which the illusion of imperial glory rested. The legend of the palace suggested that its women lived as goddesses, their skin untouched by dirt, their hair perfumed with blossoms, their chambers gleaming with jade and gold. Yet the reality hidden beneath layers of ceremony and illusion was a far less delicate truth. Daily life in the harem was marked not by purity, but by grime, not by refinement, but by discomfort, and not by glowing health, but by the constant shadow of disease. Bathing, which in the village had been a simple comfort, became within the Forbidden City a rare and complicated ordeal. Water had to be drawn from palace wells or carried in buckets by attendants. It was rationed carefully, with priority always given to those of highest rank. A favored consort might be escorted to a heated bathhouse, where eunuchs poured steaming water into a wooden tub, perfumed with rose oil and scrubbed with herbal powders. She would emerge glistening, her body smooth and fragrant, prepared for the emperor's notice. But the vast majority of concubines were given only shallow basins, often shared between several women. By the time the basin reached the lower-ranked chambers, the water was already cloudy, carrying the residue of another's rinse. A woman bent over it, splashing her face and arms, never quite clean, her hair still carrying the odor of old oil, her skin itching beneath her robe. Soap was scarce, and what little existed was coarse, made from lye and fat, leaving hands cracked and raw. Most concubines relied on sachets of dried herbs to rub against their skin, hoping to ward off the smell of sweat. Perfume was not a luxury, but a necessity, dabbed on the wrists, behind the ears, and across the collar to mask the odors that lingered in unwashed fabric. The result was a palace that smelled not of flowers, but of flowers layered over sweat, incense mingled with mildew, sandalwood struggling against the ever-present stench of human waste. Hair washing, which required far more water, was rarer still. Women went weeks, sometimes months, without a proper rinse. Instead, they dusted their scalps with rice powder, combing it through to absorb oil and disguise the sheen of grease. The powder left pale streaks along the hairline, mixing with sweat until it hardened into clumps. Lice flourished in this environment, crawling unseen beneath elaborate hairstyles, biting the scalp, leaving sores that oozed in the heat of summer. Servants whispered remedies of vinegar or crushed herbs, but the infestations never truly vanished. Clothing, too, carried its share of filth. Robes were long and heavy, brushing against damp floors, collecting dust and insects. Washing such garments required vast amounts of water and labor, so they were often aired out rather than scrubbed. Perfumed smoke was wafted through the fabric to disguise the smell, but beneath the fragrance clung the unmistakable musk of unwashed cloth. Even the most elegant embroidery concealed stains too stubborn to be removed. Concubines slipped into these robes each morning, forced to pretend they were dressed in purity when in truth they were wrapped in filth. The air within the palace was damp, heavy, and unhealthy. In summer, heat pressed down, turning chambers into stifling ovens, where sweat pooled beneath the breasts and between the thighs, where flies gathered on uncovered food, and where the water in basins turned foul within hours. In winter, the cold was biting, the stone floors like ice beneath bare feet, and the water too frigid to wash in. Fires smoked, filling rooms with soot, leaving coughs that never healed. The body, deprived of cleanliness and comfort, grew weary, and illness spread easily from chamber to chamber. Disease was an ever-present companion. Skin rashes appeared first, small red bumps from lice and fleas, spreading into angry welts that itched without relief. Then came the fevers, the coughs that rattled deep in the chest, the stomach cramps from spoiled food or foul water. Doctors were summoned only for women of high rank. For the rest, remedies consisted of bitter teas brewed by maids or whispered charms meant to chase away evil spirits. Some concubines wasted away slowly, their faces hollow, their eyes clouded, yet no one beyond their chamber walls even noticed. A new girl would soon arrive to take their place, fresh-faced and still clinging to dreams, unaware of the filth that awaited her. The toilet arrangements were another humiliation. Each chamber had a pot, emptied daily by low-ranking maids or eunuchs. The pots were rarely scrubbed thoroughly, and the stench seeped into the floorboards, into the bedding, into the very air. In winter, the contents froze into solid lumps. In summer, they swarmed with flies. The highest-ranking women had more privacy, escorted to guarded latrines with screens in attendance. The lower women relieved themselves behind thin partitions, surrounded by the sounds and smells of dozens of others. It was a reality never spoken of in poems or records, yet it defined their daily existence more than any painted fan or embroidered robe. Despite the filth, appearances had to be maintained. When officials or envoys visited, the palace was scrubbed feverishly. Incense was lit in every corridor, fresh flowers were arranged, and silks were draped to cover the stains on walls. For a brief moment, the illusion of perfection returned, convincing outsiders that the emperor's harem was a world of unbroken beauty. But once the visitors departed, the incense burned out, the flowers wilted, and the women returned to their reality of lice, mildew, and stinking basins. The young concubine learned to endure it with a quiet resignation. She pinched her nose when emptying a basin, brushed lice from her hair with a grimace, and prayed her stomach would hold after each questionable meal. She realized that beauty in the palace was a mask painted over rot, a mask she herself was forced to wear each day. When she looked in the mirror, her skin powdered, her lips tinted, her robes arranged, she saw not a goddess but a weary girl trying to hide the truth. And yet the illusion was powerful. To the world outside, she was untouchable, living in the heart of luxury. To her family, she was honored, her letters carefully crafted to reassure them of her fortune. Only she knew that the reality was far less divine. Behind the gates of gold, she lived in filth, her body aching, her spirit fading, her dreams dissolving like incense smoke in the heavy air. The heart of the harem, the very reason for its existence, was the emperor's bedchamber. Everything in the lives of the concubines, every lesson in etiquette, every embroidered robe, every bow and curtsy, was designed to prepare them for the possibility, however rare, of being summoned to that chamber. For some, the call never came, their lives spent in waiting, their beauty fading unnoticed. For others, the moment arrived suddenly, leaving them trembling, uncertain, and aware that their fate would be decided not by their will, but by the emperor's passing desire. To the outside world, intimacy with the emperor was imagined as an honor, a gift of heaven, the moment when a woman might secure her place in history. Families prayed for it, believing that a single night could transform their daughter into a consort, or even one day an empress. But for the women themselves, the truth was far more complicated. Intimacy in the palace was not born of affection nor of choice. It was commanded, and to refuse was impossible. When the summons came, it was delivered not by the emperor himself, but by eunuchs, whose word carried the weight of imperial law. A concubine, startled from her chamber, was bathed and perfumed, her body scrubbed until her skin reddened. Her hair was arranged, her robe changed, her face powdered until she no longer recognized herself. She was then carried on a quilted pallet to the emperor's quarters, often at night, when the palace lay in silence except for the whisper of sandals on stone. The ritual was as impersonal as it was elaborate, a process designed to present her as an object of perfection, stripped of individuality, prepared like an offering. Inside the chamber, the atmosphere was heavy with incense. Lanterns burned low, casting long shadows across painted screens. The emperor, often weary from affairs of state or dulled by wine, regarded her with distant eyes. For him, she was one among many, a body presented for pleasure, a face that might be remembered only briefly. For her, the experience was a mixture of fear and resignation. She could not speak unless spoken to, could not move unless guided, could not refuse under any circumstance. Intimacy in this place was not a matter of desire, but of obedience. The physical act itself was rarely tender. It was hurried, mechanical, the emperor satisfying a need before turning away. For some concubines, the experience left them cold and ashamed, their bodies aching, their minds clouded with the knowledge that they had been used but not cherished. For others, the night carried hope, the hope that a child might be conceived, that the emperor might remember their face, that fortune might finally smile upon them. Yet even in these hopes lingered the shadow of filth. Pregnancy was dangerous, and many women miscarried in the damp, unhealthy conditions of the palace. Those who bore sons might rise in power, but those who bore daughters, or no children at all, often sank further into obscurity. The rituals surrounding intimacy were as revealing as the act itself. After the encounter, eunuchs recorded the details in meticulous registers: the date, the name of the woman, the time she entered, and the time she left. These records ensured that no scandal could arise, that lineage could be traced, that every child could be attributed without question. For the women, this meant that even their most private moments were documented, reduced to entries in a ledger. Their bodies belonged not to themselves, but to the system, cataloged as part of the machinery of empire. The morning after, the concubine returned to her quarters, carried again on a pallet, her body still scented with oils, her hair disheveled, her eyes hollow. Other women watched her with envy or disdain, whispering among themselves, calculating what her night might mean for their own prospects. Some offered false congratulations, others sharpened their rivalry. The concubine herself said little. She knew that whatever had passed in that chamber, it was beyond her control, and its consequences would unfold in ways she could neither predict nor prevent. For many women, intimacy with the emperor happened only once, their names recorded in the ledger and then forgotten. For a rare few, the summons came again and again, marking them as favorites, raising their rank, showering them with gifts. But even the favored lived in constant fear, for favor was fickle, and the emperor's attention could vanish as quickly as it had appeared. To fall from grace was often worse than never having been noticed at all, for envy bred enemies, and enemies in the harem rarely rested. The filth of this intimacy was not only physical, but emotional. The concubine learned to hide her feelings, to silence her desires, to accept that her body was not her own. She lived in a world where love was a fiction, where tenderness was rare, and where the highest expression of intimacy was submission. She could never speak of longing, never confess to loneliness, never admit to shame. These were private burdens, carried in silence, masked by powdered faces and painted smiles. At night, lying awake after her return, she wondered if the emperor even remembered her face, if he could call her name, if he cared whether she lived or died. The silence of the palace offered no answer. Only the distant cries of night birds and the rustle of rats in the walls reminded her that life went on, indifferent to her suffering. And yet, despite the filth, despite the lack of choice, she still dreamed. She dreamed that perhaps one day he might look upon her with true affection, that he might listen to her words, that he might see her not as an entry in a ledger, but as a person. These dreams, fragile as smoke, sustained her through the endless days of waiting, the endless nights of silence. They were illusions, but in the palace, illusions were sometimes the only thing that kept the women alive. The harem was filled with silks, perfumes, and jewels. Yet the women who lived within its painted chambers often bore bodies marked not by beauty, but by affliction. Beneath the layers of brocade and the powders dusted across their cheeks, skin told another story, one of rashes, sores, and illness born from filth. In the portraits that survived, concubines appear flawless, their faces like porcelain, their hands like ivory. But the truth, known only to those who walked the stone corridors, was that their bodies carried the hidden price of life inside the Forbidden City. The environment itself conspired against them. Summers in Beijing were sweltering, the air thick with heat that clung to every surface. Concubines sat in damp chambers, their robes sticking to their backs, sweat pooling in the creases of their skin. Baths were rare and water rationed, so salt and grime built up across their bodies until rashes bloomed along their thighs, under their arms and beneath their breasts. The itching was unbearable, and many women scratched until they bled, their nails leaving angry red trails across pale skin. Eunuchs sometimes scolded them for appearing disheveled, yet offered no remedy beyond silence. In winter, the cold was no kinder. Stone floors radiated chill that seeped into the bones. Fires smoked heavily, filling chambers with soot that irritated lungs and eyes. Dryness cracked lips, split fingers, and left skin flaking. Women tried to soften their bodies with oils, but the supplies were limited, and the oils often rancid. Frostbite nipped at toes during long nights when bedding was too thin. Illnesses of the chest, coughs, wheezing, fevers, spread rapidly, and without proper treatment, many faded slowly, their beauty eroded by the harsh rhythm of the seasons. Parasites were constant companions. Lice thrived in unwashed hair, biting the scalp, leaving sores that festered. Fleas nested in bedding, biting through the night, their marks visible along ankles and calves. Bed bugs crept from cracks in the walls, their bites swelling into welts that women tried to conceal with powder. Even worms and other unseen pests entered through spoiled food or tainted water, causing cramps, diarrhea, and wasting. The palace physicians might attend to favored women, but most concubines were left to endure their ailments in silence, relying on bitter herbal teas brewed by sympathetic maids. Skin diseases carried not only discomfort, but shame. Smooth, pale skin was considered the essence of beauty, the sign of refinement. Yet many women bore scars from boils, discolorations from fungal infections, or blotches from fevers that had ravaged their bodies. They hid beneath layers of powder, but the truth revealed itself under candlelight, in the privacy of bedchambers, or in the whispers of rivals eager to destroy reputations. A single blemish could become the subject of gossip, whispered from chamber to chamber, reducing a woman's chances of ever gaining the emperor's attention. The sores and sicknesses also left their mark on intimacy. Women summoned to the emperor feared not only his indifference but his disgust. If he noticed the roughness of their skin, the odor of infection, or the sores hidden beneath robes, he might turn away in disdain, condemning them to a lifetime of obscurity. Thus, many concubines lived in constant anxiety, knowing their bodies were both their only power and their greatest vulnerability. They powdered, perfumed, and polished themselves relentlessly, not for pleasure, but in desperate attempts to mask the filth and disease that gnawed beneath the surface. Illness bred not only in the body but in the mind. The constant itching, the fevers, the cramps, all of it wore down the spirit. Women grew irritable, snapping at attendants, quarreling with each other, weeping alone at night. Despair took root, deepened by the knowledge that even in suffering, they could not leave. A concubine's body was not her own. It belonged to the palace, to the emperor, to the system that cataloged her like livestock. To fall ill was not simply misfortune. It was another form of imprisonment, another reminder that she was trapped. The palace itself seemed to conspire in spreading disease. Drainage was poor, and rainwater pooled in courtyards, breeding mosquitoes in summer. Waste was carried out in buckets, spilling across stones, leaving behind invisible trails of contamination. Kitchens were crowded and unsanitary, with flies swarming over uncovered meat. Rats darted boldly through storerooms, their droppings scattered among sacks of grain. The concubines, powerless to change their environment, became victims of it, their bodies absorbing the filth of the very palace that claimed to represent divine order. And yet outward appearances had to be maintained. Court ceremonies demanded concubines appear flawless, their hair lacquered, their faces powdered, their robes immaculate. No one outside the harem ever saw the sores beneath their sleeves, the bandages hidden beneath collars, the fevers endured in silence. Visitors and envoys reported seeing women of otherworldly beauty, their movements graceful, their presence ethereal. They never saw the reality, the swollen ankles, the rashes, the exhaustion behind lowered eyes. Illness remained invisible, hidden by layers of performance, concealed behind the unyielding mask of imperial splendor. For the young concubine, the realization was sobering. She had once imagined that her body, kept clean and cared for, would be her path to favor. Instead, she found herself in constant battle against forces she could not control: lice, fleas, rashes, infections. She endured them not in private, but in a crowded chamber where every weakness was observed, judged, and perhaps exploited. Her body, meant to be her greatest weapon, became instead her most fragile burden. At night, she lay awake, scratching her skin until it burned, listening to the coughs of women in neighboring rooms, hearing the faint scuttle of rats. She dreamed of cool rivers, of clean air, of the simple comfort of bathing without fear of rationed water. Yet dawn always came, bringing with it another day of filth disguised as refinement, another day of sickness masked by powder and perfume. The palace might glitter in the morning sun, but beneath its rooftops, the concubines carried the hidden truth upon their very skin. If the filth of the harem could be seen in its dirty basins, its lice-ridden bedding, and its foul-smelling air, there was another kind of filth that was less visible, but even more corrosive. It was the filth of suspicion, of whispered rumors, of carefully plotted betrayals that stained not the body but the spirit. The Forbidden City was not merely a physical prison. It was a world where envy and rivalry bred endlessly, where survival demanded deception, and where even a smile might conceal the sharp edge of malice. From the moment a girl entered the harem, she was taught not only how to bow and sing, but how to watch the movements of others, to notice who spoke too often, who smiled too widely, who received slightly better food or fresher water. In the palace, every detail was evidence, and every detail could be twisted into a weapon. If one concubine was summoned by the emperor, another might whisper that she had bribed the eunuchs. If a woman's robe was too fine, her rivals might claim she had overstepped her station. A misplaced glance, a careless word, even an innocent laugh could become fodder for accusation. The concubines lived under constant surveillance, not only from officials and eunuchs, but from one another. Friendships were possible, but fragile, always haunted by the question of whether a confidant might one day turn rival. Women whispered their secrets in the dark, then lay awake fearing that those secrets might be carried to the empress by morning. Trust was rare and paranoia flourished. The palace was filled not with laughter, but with listening ears, waiting to catch a slip that could bring another woman down. Jealousy, too, festered like rot. If one woman received the emperor's favor, others sharpened their envy in silence. They sent maids to spy. They bribed eunuchs for information. They scattered rumors like seeds, hoping they would take root. A comb might be tampered with, its teeth smeared with irritants to inflame the scalp. Herbs might be slipped into tea, not strong enough to kill, but enough to bring days of weakness. A robe might be subtly damaged, a sleeve torn just before a ceremony, ensuring humiliation before the court. Few acts were openly violent. Instead, cruelty worked in whispers, in hidden powders, in words that poisoned reputations long before bodies. The empress at the top of the hierarchy held authority to judge these disputes. Yet she too was often entangled in them, for her power depended on maintaining her dominance over rivals. She encouraged vigilance, sometimes rewarding those who exposed supposed conspiracies, sometimes punishing women based on rumor alone. This climate ensured that suspicion became the air everyone breathed. To survive, concubines learned not to ask if a rumor was true, but how best to use it. Truth mattered less than advantage. The young concubine discovered this quickly. She watched as one of her companions was accused of arrogance simply for wearing a hairpin that gleamed too brightly. The empress ordered her punished, and she was stripped of her ornaments, her head bowed in disgrace. Another woman was accused of speaking ill of a superior. Whether she had said the words or not did not matter. She was confined for weeks in a cold chamber, emerging pale and trembling, her spirit broken. The lesson was clear. Survival was not about innocence, but about staying unseen, never drawing too much notice, never giving rivals the chance to strike. Yet remaining invisible carried its own dangers. To be overlooked by the emperor meant fading into obscurity, a slow death of the spirit. Thus, every woman balanced between two perils. To be noticed was to invite envy. To be ignored was to vanish. The harem was a place where filth lived, not only in lice and rats, but in the constant corrosion of trust, in the way ambition forced women to betray one another, in the way survival demanded cruelty disguised as courtesy. At night, in the silence of her chamber, the concubine lay awake, remembering the smiles of women she no longer trusted, the warmth of hands that might one day deliver her downfall. She thought of the words she dared not speak, of the laughter she swallowed, of the tears she hid. The true prison of the palace was not the gates or the walls, but the knowledge that every relationship was tainted, every kindness suspect, every gesture possibly a trap. And yet she could not abandon hope. Somewhere in the maze of suspicion, she dreamed of finding a companion she could trust, someone who would not betray her for rank or favor. This dream, like so many in the palace, was fragile, but it kept her spirit alive amid the filth of intrigue. Without it, she would have drowned in paranoia. With it, she endured, telling herself that even in a world built on deceit, there might be a corner where truth could survive. The filth of the spirit was perhaps the cruelest part of life in the Forbidden City. Dirt could be washed away, rashes could sometimes heal, but suspicion lingered, staining every thought, every breath. The women of the harem lived in splendor, but their souls were wrapped in grime, corroded by envy, poisoned by deceit. It was a filth unseen in paintings, unrecorded in ledgers, yet more suffocating than any stench of waste. For those trapped within the palace walls, this was the truest form of imprisonment. Not chains of iron, but chains of mistrust, binding them tighter than any lock or gate. The Forbidden City was designed as the pinnacle of order, walls aligned to celestial principles, gates arranged with ritual precision, rooftops shimmering like scales of a dragon. Yet beneath that harmony, another kingdom thrived, one that cared nothing for symmetry or ceremony. It was the kingdom of vermin, of creatures that crept in silence, swarmed in darkness, and claimed the palace as their own. For the concubines, nights were never still, because the palace never belonged entirely to them. It belonged also to rats, insects, and the terrors they carried in their wake. By day, the illusion of control held firm. Courtyards gleamed under the sweep of attendants. Incense masked the odors of rot, and visitors marveled at the grandeur of the halls. But when the lanterns dimmed and silence fell, the other inhabitants stirred. Rats emerged from cracks in the walls, their whiskers twitching, their claws scratching softly along the floors. They darted across chambers, bold and unafraid, nibbling at forgotten scraps, gnawing at wooden beams, and rustling through bedding. Concubines lay awake, listening to their sounds, the faint squeak of teeth against grain, the thud of small bodies leaping from shelves. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by the knowledge that unseen eyes glinted in the shadows. Insects were everywhere. Fleas leapt from bedding to skin, biting through thin robes, leaving angry welts that burned through the night. Lice nested in hair, spreading from one woman to another, their bites causing incessant itching, their eggs clinging stubbornly to strands no matter how often they were combed. Bed bugs hid in the seams of mattresses, creeping out when the chambers grew quiet, their bites swelling into blotches that no powder could conceal. Flies swarmed in summer, drawn by chamber pots and food left too long in the heat, their buzzing relentless, their presence a constant reminder of filth. The palace guards, eunuchs, and attendants learned to ignore this other kingdom. Rats were too many, insects too persistent, filth too deeply woven into the fabric of the palace to be erased. Occasionally, hunts were organized, with cats released into the halls or fumigation attempted with acrid smoke. But the vermin always returned. They thrived in the dampness of the cellars, in the storerooms of rice and grain, in the piles of waste that accumulated faster than servants could carry them away. The Forbidden City, so orderly in design, was porous in practice, and the smallest creatures claimed its forgotten corners. For the concubine, the nightly terrors carried more than discomfort. They carried humiliation. How could a woman present herself as a goddess of refinement when her body was marked with flea bites, her hair crawling with lice, her skin scarred from endless scratching? How could she hope for the emperor's favor when she lay awake, flinching at the scuttle of rats, her eyes hollow from lost sleep? The vermin stripped away the illusions of grandeur, reducing even the most exalted concubine to the same level as the lowest servant. Just another body vulnerable to the bite of an insect, the scratch of a rat's claw. Stories spread among the women, whispered in the dark, of rats gnawing at sleeping feet, of infants left unattended, found bloodied by bites, of insects swarming so thickly in summer that the air seemed alive with wings. Some tales were exaggerations, but others bore the weight of truth, repeated by too many mouths to be dismissed. The palace might claim divine order, but the vermin reminded everyone that decay ruled as surely as the emperor. The psychological toll was immense. Nights became battlegrounds where women lay rigid, straining to hear the slightest sound, their imaginations magnifying every rustle into a threat. Sleep-deprived, they grew irritable, snapping at attendants, quarreling with each other, weeping silently into their sleeves. The palace was supposed to be a place of dreams, yet it denied its women the most basic dream of all: rest without fear, and still appearances had to be maintained. At dawn, the concubines rose, powdered their faces, arranged their hair, and presented themselves as paragons of beauty. No one beyond the palace walls ever saw the raw skin beneath their robes, the scars hidden by sleeves, the exhaustion in their eyes. Visitors saw only perfection, never realizing that those same women had spent the night battling fleas, flinching at rats, and lying awake in dread of unseen creatures. For the young concubine, the nights were the cruelest hours. By day, she could distract herself with lessons, with embroidery, with the small routines of survival. But at night, lying in the silence of her chamber, she felt utterly powerless. Every scratch in the walls reminded her that the palace was not hers, that no rank or robe could protect her from the smallest invaders. The grandeur of the Forbidden City was a mask, and beneath it, filth crawled freely. Over time, she learned small defenses. She stuffed rags into cracks, scattered herbs thought to repel insects, begged her maid for scraps of mint or vinegar to rub into her skin. These measures offered brief relief, but no true solution. The vermin always returned, undeterred, claiming their share of the palace night after night. She came to realize that their persistence was not an accident, but a symbol. A reminder that no matter how carefully humans sought to impose order, decay always found its way in. In the silence before dawn, as the first bells rang across the palace, the concubines sometimes wondered which kingdom truly ruled the Forbidden City. Was it the emperor, seated on his dragon throne, or was it the rats in the walls, the insects in the bedding, the vermin who crept unchecked through the darkness? The thought chilled her more than the night air, for it suggested a truth too dangerous to say aloud, that beneath the glitter of empire, filth always held its throne. To outsiders, the palace kitchens were imagined as the beating heart of abundance. Envoys described tables groaning with delicacies, roasted duck glistening with honey glaze, bowls of steaming rice fragrant with jasmine, platters of fresh fruit carried in from distant provinces. To the common people of Beijing, it was said that a single banquet for the emperor could feed an entire village for a month. Yet for the women of the harem, the daily reality of food was far removed from these grand illusions. Their meals were not feasts but disappointments, not luxuries but reminders of their place in the machinery of the court. The preparation of food was itself a monumental task. The palace employed thousands of cooks, each assigned to different duties, some to roast meats, others to steam grains, still others to prepare sweets or teas. Ingredients poured in daily, fish from southern rivers, melons from northern fields, spices from the western trade routes. But abundance was not the same as quality. The long journey to the capital left many goods spoiled before they ever reached the kitchens. Fish arrived limp, their bellies bloated with rot. Fruits bruised and overripe released the scent of fermentation. Grains, stored too long in damp cellars, carried the crunch of insects between the teeth. The cooks did what they could, salting, boiling, drowning the food in spices, but no amount of preparation could mask decay completely. Distribution was governed by rank, as rigid as every other aspect of palace life. At the top, the empress and favored consorts received the freshest offerings. Their rice was steamed, white and clean, their meats carved tender, their fruit peeled and plated with elegance. Below them, the concubines received what was left. By the time the trays reached their quarters, the rice had cooled into clumps, the broth had congealed into grease, and the vegetables had wilted into tasteless mush. In summer, the dishes arrived swarmed with flies, their sweetness spoiled by heat. In winter, they arrived cold, the oils hardened, the flavors dulled. Sometimes the food was not only unappetizing, but dangerous. Spoiled meat brought stomach cramps that twisted through the night, diarrhea that left women weak and pale, fevers that spread from chamber to chamber. Doctors were summoned for the high-ranking, but lower women endured in silence, clutching their bellies, praying that the sickness would pass. Whispers spread of women who never recovered, their bodies wasting away from months of tainted meals. Hunger itself became a form of filth, gnawing not only at the stomach, but at the spirit. The act of eating, meant to bring comfort, became instead a humiliation. Concubines sat before lacquered trays, lifting chopsticks with the poise demanded of them, pretending not to notice the faint smell of rot rising from their bowls. They smiled at attendants, feigned gratitude, and swallowed quickly before their stomachs rebelled. Every bite carried with it the reminder that even in the heart of supposed abundance, They were denied the simplest dignity of clean food. The kitchens themselves were a realm of chaos. Fires roared day and night, smoke thickening the air until eyes burned and throats coughed. Floors were slick with grease, knives clanged against wooden boards, and buckets of waste overflowed in corners. Rats darted boldly among the cook's feet, nibbling at scraps. Eunuchs in charge of provisions skimmed supplies, selling the best cuts in secret markets and leaving the harem with what remained. Bribes determined much of what arrived in a concubine's chamber. A jewel discreetly given might secure a piece of fresh fruit. A refusal to pay might condemn her to days of nothing but thin porridge. The young concubine quickly learned to lower her expectations. In her family's home, a simple bowl of rice and vegetables had been filling, eaten in laughter and warmth. Here, meals carried no joy. They were tasks endured silently, punctuated by the faint sound of rats in the walls or the buzzing of flies overhead. Sometimes when the rice was especially stale or the broth especially greasy, she pushed the bowl away, choosing hunger over the sickness that would surely follow. But hunger itself was another form of suffering. Her stomach knotted, her body weakened, and her spirit sank with the knowledge that she lived in the palace of emperors, yet starved like a beggar. Ceremonial banquets provided sharp contrast. On rare occasions, the harem was summoned to attend the emperor at a feast. Tables were laid with delicacies in endless variety: shark fin soup, bird's nest stews, sweet pastries dripping with honey, wines poured into jade cups. For a brief moment, the women tasted the splendor sung of in poems. Yet even here, there was bitterness. They were allowed only to sample, their portions small, their movements watched. The majority of the feast was for the emperor and his guests, while the women performed their roles as ornaments, their hunger masked by painted smiles. Once the banquet ended, the food was whisked away, much of it discarded, leaving the concubines to return to their usual rations of stale rice and greasy broth. The cruelty of food in the palace was not only its filth, but its symbolism. It reminded the women each day of their place, that they were not guests of honor, but prisoners, sustained just enough to live, never enough to thrive. Their meals were not a reward, but a reminder that even sustenance could be corrupted by hierarchy, by neglect, and by decay. At night, lying awake in her chamber, the concubine's stomach often groaned with emptiness. She thought of the kitchens only a few courtyards away, overflowing with ingredients, yet knew that those riches would never be hers. She dreamed of home, of simple meals eaten in freedom, a bowl of steaming rice, fresh greens from the garden, fish caught that morning from a river. The memory of those humble meals filled her with more longing than any banquet of jade and gold. For in those memories, food had been clean, honest, and shared in love. In the palace, it was spoiled, politicized, and stripped of comfort. Thus, the daily meals of the harem became another layer of filth, another cruelty hidden behind the illusion of splendor. The palace fed its women not with abundance, but with scraps disguised as riches, with hunger wrapped in ceremony. And so they endured, swallowing not only spoiled food, but the bitter knowledge that in the very center of empire, they were left to starve in silence. For centuries, poets and painters spoke of the palace bathhouses as places of enchantment. They imagined marble pools filled with steaming water, the air scented with lotus petals, and concubines drifting like ethereal spirits through clouds of perfume steam. To the world outside the vermilion walls, these bathhouses symbolized refinement itself, the union of luxury and purity. But for the women who stepped inside them, the truth was far less divine. The bathhouses were not sanctuaries but stages, their beauty a thin mask stretched over hidden rot. The bathhouses were reserved for those of rank or for nights when the emperor summoned a woman to his side. The lesser concubines rarely, if ever, set foot within them. When the young concubine was first led into one, she felt a rush of awe. Lanterns flickered against polished tiles. Steam curled upward in soft clouds, and attendants moved gracefully with towels and oils in hand. At first glance, it seemed like the paradise she had been promised. Yet as her eyes adjusted, she began to notice the details. The cracked tiles at the edges of the pool, the faint smell of mildew beneath the perfume, the dark stains that clung to the stone despite constant scrubbing. The illusion of perfection wavered, and reality slipped through. Water was carried in by servants, bucket by bucket, from wells and cisterns scattered across the palace. In summer, the water grew stagnant quickly, tinged with algae, and in winter it froze at the edges before it reached the bathhouse. Attendants perfumed it with rose oil, jasmine blossoms, or crushed herbs to disguise the taste and smell. But no fragrance could erase the truth of unclean water. Women slipped into the pools, the surface shimmering with oils, but beneath the fragrance lingered grit, insects, and the faint slickness of decay. For the favored, attendants knelt at the edge, scrubbing their arms with cloths dipped in scented water, massaging oils into their skin, combing fragrant powders into their hair. But even these luxuries carried hidden discomfort. The oils often turned rancid if stored too long, leaving a faint sourness. The powders clogged pores, mixing with sweat until the skin erupted in rashes. Women emerged glistening, but beneath the sheen their bodies itched, their scalps stung, and their skin burned with irritation. For the lower concubines, the bathhouse was not paradise, but humiliation. They were rushed through, given only the dregs of water after higher-ranked women had finished. The basins grew cloudy, the oils dispersed into greasy films, the flowers wilted into slimy fragments. Some women chose not to bathe at all, preferring the smell of sweat to the indignity of rinsing themselves in another's refuse. Perfumes became their shield, sprayed liberally onto skin and robes, so that the palace seemed fragrant even while filth lingered underneath. Disease spread easily in these bathhouses. Shared basins carried infections from one body to another. Sores worsened in stagnant water, fungi thrived in damp stone, and coughs echoed through the steam-filled rooms. Women whispered of rashes that never healed, of fevers that followed nights in the baths, of infections that scarred them permanently. Yet refusing to bathe was dangerous, for cleanliness was demanded when summoned to the emperor. Thus the bathhouses became traps. To enter was to risk sickness, to refuse was to risk disgrace. Perfume, the supposed solution, was its own burden. Imported at enormous cost, perfumes filled the palace with heavy sweetness, masking rot but never erasing it. The scent of sandalwood clung to chamber pots, the fragrance of roses wafted from damp robes, and the air itself seemed saturated with competing odors. The concubine learned to associate perfume not with beauty, but with concealment. It was a veil that hid the truth of filth without removing it, a constant reminder that nothing in the palace was as pure as it seemed. The illusion of the bathhouses was carefully maintained for outsiders. Envoys were sometimes shown glimpses of steaming pools, of women perfumed and robed, their skin glistening with oils. They returned home with tales of heavenly refinement, never realizing that the pools were often dirty, the perfumes rancid, the women suffering from sores beneath their painted smiles. The palace excelled at illusion, presenting paradise to the world, while its captives endured filth behind the veil. For the young concubine, the bathhouse was one of the most bitter revelations. She had entered the palace believing that here at least, she would find purity and comfort. Instead, she found water that made her skin itch, perfumes that stung her nose, and a routine that left her feeling more unclean than before. She learned to lower her expectations, to rinse quickly, to mask the smell with powder, and to avoid looking too closely at the grime clinging to the stone. At night, lying in her chamber, she sometimes dreamed of the river near her childhood home. Its water had been cold and clear, flowing freely over smooth stones, scented with nothing but air and earth. She remembered plunging into it, laughing with cousins, emerging shivering but refreshed. That memory haunted her more than any illusion of marble pools or perfumed steam, for she understood now that the palace, with all its grandeur, could never provide what the simplest river once had: true cleanliness, true refreshment, and freedom from rot. Thus, the bathhouses of the Forbidden City stood as symbols of contradiction. To the world, they were sanctuaries of beauty. To the women within, they were illusions, masking filth with perfume, disguising decay with fragrance. They promised purity but delivered sickness, promised refinement but delivered humiliation. And like so much else in the harem, they revealed the cruelest truth of all: that beneath every shimmer of splendor lay hidden rot, waiting quietly to be endured. Every palace, no matter how gilded, must contend with the simple truth of the body. Even in the Forbidden City, where dragons coiled across golden roofs and ceremonies reflected the order of the heavens, concubines had to relieve themselves. Yet the reality of the palace latrines was a subject no poet dared to capture, no chronicler wished to record. It was a truth hidden behind screens, whispered about only in disgust, and endured in silence. For the women of the harem, the latrines were less a necessity than a daily humiliation, a reminder that beneath the robes of silk and the powder of refinement, they were trapped in filth. The grand illusion suggested otherwise. Visitors might have been told of marble washrooms, of attendants waiting with towels, of perfumed basins where even this most basic act was transformed into elegance. But the reality was far from elegant. The palace relied on chamber pots and communal latrines, crude arrangements for a place that claimed to embody divine civilization. Each chamber contained a pot, sometimes hidden by a painted screen, emptied each morning by low-ranking servants. The higher-ranking women might be escorted to guarded latrines with partitions and attendants, but even these were little more than wooden planks over pits, the smell thick enough to choke the air. The stench was inescapable. In summer, it grew overpowering as heat turned waste into swarms of flies, buzzing so loudly that women had to wave them away with sleeves. In winter, the contents froze solid, the icy stench lingering long after attendants carried it away. The pots were rarely scrubbed clean, leaving behind stains and odors that seeped into the floorboards, into the bedding, into the very fabric of the chamber. Incense was lit constantly, perfumes poured liberally, but the sweetness only mixed grotesquely with the stench, never conquering it. For the concubines, the act of using these facilities was fraught with indignity. Privacy was a luxury in short supply. Screens were thin, attendants waited nearby, and footsteps echoed through the corridors. Even whispers carried. A woman relieved herself knowing that others could hear, smell, and sometimes even see the faint shadow of her body behind the screen. For those raised on ideals of refinement and purity, this was not merely uncomfortable, it was humiliating. Their most human needs were exposed, stripped of dignity, reduced to filth. The servants who carried away the pots added another layer of shame. Eunuchs and maids moved through the palace each morning with buckets sloshing, their hands and robes stained from spills, their faces weary with disgust. The concubines avoided their eyes, pretending not to notice, pretending that the waste of their own bodies was not paraded daily through the corridors of the Son of Heaven. But everyone knew. The filth was as much a part of the palace as the golden tiles, unavoidable and unspoken. Disease found fertile ground in such conditions. Waste spilled during transport, contaminating the courtyards, seeping into the soil, carried back into chambers on the sandals of servants. Insects thrived, spreading sickness from one woman to another. Dysentery was common, its cramps and fevers leaving women weak and trembling. Some suffered in silence, too ashamed to admit their pain, too fearful of punishment if they were deemed unclean. A concubine's body was supposed to be flawless, yet the latrines made mockery of that ideal, reducing even the most beautiful to coughing, sweating shells, their dignity stripped away by the stench of necessity. The hierarchy extended even here. The empress had her own private facilities, attended by careful eunuchs who scrubbed and perfumed them daily. Favored consorts enjoyed greater privacy, their pots cleaned more thoroughly, their attendants more discreet. But the lower women endured the worst. They shared communal pits, the stench unbearable, the conditions degrading. To refuse was not an option. To complain was dangerous. And so they endured, faces composed, voices calm, while inside they seethed with humiliation. For the young concubine, the latrines became a symbol of her captivity. At home, she had known the freedom of squatting in the open fields, of relieving herself in the fresh air, of washing afterward in a cool stream. It had been humble, but it had been clean. Here, within the golden walls of empire, she squatted behind thin screens, surrounded by stench, watched by attendants, her body reduced to another routine of shame. The contradiction struck her deeply, that in the place most celebrated as the center of civilization, she felt dirtier, more humiliated, and more trapped than she ever had in her village. At night, when incense burned low and silence fell, the odor crept back, seeping into chambers, waking women from uneasy sleep. They turned on their palates, pressing sleeves to their noses, whispering complaints to one another in the dark. Yet no change came. The filth was too vast, too constant, too integral to the palace's structure to ever be removed. It was a hidden truth, carried in the air, breathed by every woman, endured by every concubine. And so the latrines of the Forbidden City remained not places of relief, but of shame. They were the spaces where illusions shattered most completely, where no perfume, no robe, no painted screen could disguise the reality of filth. They reminded the concubines each day that no matter how much they powdered their faces, no matter how carefully they performed the rituals of refinement, they were still captives of the body, captives of the palace, captives of filth. The Forbidden City was imagined as a fortress against chaos. Its vermilion walls said to guard not only the emperor, but the very order of the world. Yet even those walls could not keep out the breath of disease. Illness slipped silently into the courtyards, riding on the air, carried by vermin, by servants, by the very water drawn from palace wells. And once it entered, it spread like fire through dry grass, leaving fear and silence in its wake. For the concubines, plague was not a distant rumor from villages beyond the capital. It was an intimate visitor that crept into their chambers, sat at the edge of their beds, and breathed directly into their lungs. The palace was a breeding ground for sickness. Thousands lived within its walls. The emperor, his family, his concubines, eunuchs, guards, cooks, servants. Every courtyard hummed with life, and every chamber pressed bodies too close together. Ventilation was poor. In winter, windows were sealed against the cold, trapping smoke and damp air until throats burned. In summer, heat thickened the air, and the smell of sweat, mildew, and waste clung to everything. Disease thrived in such conditions. A cough from one chamber spread to the next. A fever in a maid could find its way to her mistress. Flies and fleas carried infection across the palace with ease. When plague struck, its signs were unmistakable. First came the coughs, dry and persistent, echoing through the corridors like distant drums. Then the fevers, bodies flushed and trembling, sweat-soaking bedding. Soon women collapsed, their skin pale, their lips cracked, their eyes clouded with delirium. Some survived after weeks of weakness. Others faded quickly, their bodies carried out in silence, their names whispered only briefly before being forgotten. The palace, for all its grandeur, had no mercy for the sick. Those of low rank were left to die quietly, their suffering hidden, their chambers reassigned as soon as they were emptied. Fear was as deadly as the illness itself. Concubines avoided one another, keeping distance even from their closest companions. They whispered behind sleeves, eyes darting at every cough, every pale face, every shadow beneath the eyes. Suspicion grew alongside sickness. Women accused rivals of feigning illness, to avoid duties or of deliberately spreading disease to sabotage others. Attendants were questioned harshly, their loyalty doubted, their hands inspected for signs of contagion. The harem, already poisoned by jealousy, became thick with paranoia. The physicians of the court moved briskly through the chaos, their remedies a mix of herbs, prayers, and ritual fumigations. They burned bundles of wormwood, filling chambers with acrid smoke meant to chase away evil spirits. They prescribed bitter teas brewed from dried roots, forcing women to swallow until their stomachs churned. Sometimes they lanced sores, releasing foul-smelling pus, their instruments barely cleaned before moving to the next patient. The favored consorts received the best care, their bedding changed, their chambers fumigated, their meals prepared with caution. The lesser women were lucky to receive a cup of lukewarm tea. For many, the doctors came too late, or not at all. The young concubine watched in silence as illness spread through her courtyard. She saw a woman once radiant reduced to a coughing skeleton, her lips cracked, her eyes staring blankly at the ceiling, until the attendants carried her away wrapped in a thin blanket. She smelled the sickness in the air, a mixture of sweat, smoke, and something sour that clung to the nostrils. She lay awake at night listening to the moans drifting from other chambers, wondering if the fever would find her next. The fear of plague changed daily life in subtle but relentless ways. Meals were eaten quickly, with chopsticks dipped in vinegar said to kill invisible poisons. Incense was burned more heavily until the air grew choking with its sweetness. Women carried charms of jade or stitched sachets of herbs to wear at their waists, hoping they might shield them from contagion. They whispered prayers to deities, begged ancestors for protection, and promised offerings if only they survived another season. But even when the waves of disease passed, the scars remained. Survivors bore hollow cheeks, lingering coughs, or sores that refused to heal. They returned to the routines of the palace, powdered their faces, arranged their hair, and performed their bows. But the shadow of illness clung to them. The harem demanded beauty, yet plague left only frailty. Some women were dismissed from favor not because of rivalry, but because their bodies no longer fit the image of perfection the emperor expected. Survival itself became a punishment, for it robbed them of the very asset on which their worth depended. Plague also stripped away the illusions of the forbidden city. The concubine realized that no matter how tall the walls, no matter how many gates or guards, disease always found a way in. The vermilion paint could not hide the mildew, the golden tiles could not keep out vermin, the perfumes could not mask the odor of decay. The palace might be the heart of empire, but it was also a breeding ground of death. The illusion of control dissolved with every cough, every fever, every body carried silently through the gates at dawn. For the young concubine, this truth brought a quiet despair. She had once believed that the palace was untouchable, that within its walls she would find safety, even if not happiness. Now she understood that safety was a lie. The same walls that trapped her also trapped disease. The same gates that kept the world out also locked sickness in. She was not protected, she was confined, and the air she breathed carried as much danger as the rival she feared. At night, when the fevered coughing subsided for a moment, she lay on her bedding and thought of the open fields of her village. There, the air had been fresh, the wind carrying the scent of soil and grass. Here, the air was heavy with smoke, incense, and sickness, pressing down like an unseen weight. She longed for one deep breath of clean air, one night without fear of plague creeping into her lungs. But the palace gave her only more incense, more whispers, more dread. And so the forbidden city in all its grandeur remained a place where filth was not only seen, but breathed. Disease lingered in every courtyard, every chamber, every whisper of wind. It reminded the concubines daily that no amount of ceremony or splendor could protect them from decay. For within those walls, the breath of disease was as constant as the beating of drums, and it carried with it the cruelest truth, that even in the very heart of empire, they were never safe. The harem was never only women. Moving quietly among the silks and painted screens were the eunuchs and maids, the silent machinery that kept the palace alive. Without them, food would not reach the chambers, robes would not be laundered, incense would not burn, and waste would not be carried away. To the concubines, these figures were at once lifelines and threats, their presence as constant as the vermin in the walls, their loyalty as uncertain as the wind. They lived close enough to witness every secret, yet distant enough to betray without hesitation. The eunuchs were everywhere. They guarded the gates of courtyards, delivered messages, escorted women to the emperor's chambers. Their voices were high, their faces often pale and smooth, their bodies marked by the mutilation that defined their role. Some were gentle, sympathetic, and treated the concubines with kindness. Others were cruel, wielding their authority with quiet malice, knowing that a single whisper from them could destroy a woman's standing. They controlled the flow of goods, and with control came corruption. A eunuch might skim meat from the kitchens, siphon oil from the stores, sell the best silks in secret markets. A concubine who wished for fresher water or cleaner bedding often had to pay with jewels, favors, or promises. The palace economy of filth was in their hands. The maids, often young girls from poor families, served as attendants to the concubines. They dressed them, combed their hair, carried their chamber pots, and bore the brunt of punishment when mistakes were made. They saw everything, the sores hidden beneath sleeves, the tears wiped quickly away, the whispered schemes shared in the dark. Some were loyal, binding themselves to their mistress's fortunes, rising or falling alongside her. Others betrayed without remorse, carrying tales to rivals or to eunuchs in exchange for safety or small rewards. The concubines could never be certain whether the hands that tied their sashes also tightened the noose around their fate. Filth bound them all together. Maids scrubbed lice from bedding, only to carry the insects in their own hair. Eunuchs emptied pots, splashing waste across their robes, their hands perpetually stained. Concubines leaned on them for survival, yet recoiled from their touch, reminded that intimacy with servants blurred the fragile line between dignity and disgrace. The young concubine often felt that she lived as closely with her maid as with a sister, yet never with the certainty of trust. One careless word spoken in sympathy might echo in the empress's ear by morning. And yet without these allies in filth, survival was impossible. A kind eunuch might slip an orange into a concubine's tray, saving her from hunger. A loyal maid might heat water in secret, offering her mistress a rare chance to wash properly. Small mercies mattered more than jewels. They became threads of humanity woven through the palace's tapestry of decay. The concubine learned quickly to nurture these fragile alliances, offering smiles, coins, or trinkets in exchange for loyalty, knowing that a single act of kindness could mean the difference between comfort and misery. The relationships were complicated further by proximity to the emperor. Eunuchs escorted women to his chambers, recording names and times in ledgers. Maids prepared them for the encounter, bathing them, powdering them, adjusting their robes. These attendants stood at the threshold of intimacy, close enough to see the humiliation of command, close enough to hear the muffled sobs of women summoned against their will. They carried the scent of perfume and sweat back into the corridors, whispering tales of what they had seen. Their power was not their own, but borrowed from their position, and yet it was power nonetheless. The filth of these relationships lay not only in corruption, but in dependency. Concubines depended on eunuchs for access to food, for letters smuggled from family, for whispers of court intrigue. They depended on maids for cleanliness, for companionship, for the simplest comforts of life. Yet this dependency was a chain, binding them to people who might betray them at any moment. The concubine often wondered whether it was worse to be betrayed by a rival or by the maid who had shared her bedchamber since the day she arrived. At night, she sometimes heard her maid crying softly in the dark, homesick for the village she had left behind, frightened by the punishments she had witnessed. In those moments, the concubine felt a strange kinship, realizing that both of them were captives of the palace, both trapped in systems they could not escape. Yet even in that kinship lingered caution. Compassion could not erase the danger. The maid might still betray her if pressed, and the eunuch might still use her for his own advantage. Trust in the palace was never free. The eunuchs too bore their own humiliation. Stripped of manhood, mocked by guards and officials, they wielded power in the harem as a way to reclaim dignity. Some became bitter, delighting in the suffering of concubines, as if inflicting pain restored what had been taken from them. Others, perhaps softened by their own wounds, became protectors, guarding women quietly, shielding them from harsher punishments. The concubine learned to read their faces carefully, to distinguish between cruelty and kindness, to place her fragile hopes in those who showed even a glimmer of humanity. In the end, life in the palace was not shaped only by emperors and empresses, but by these overlooked figures, by eunuchs carrying trays of food, by maids scrubbing stained bedding, by the small hands and weary eyes that bore witness to filth and survival alike. They were the unseen gears of the great machine, and without them, the harem would collapse. But to the concubine, they were more than gears. They were the closest thing she had to allies, bound to her by necessity, trust, and betrayal in equal measure. Thus, the filth of the palace was never endured alone. It was shared in secret glances, in whispered bargains, in buckets carried through corridors at dawn. Eunuchs and maids lived beside the concubines in the same shadows, breathing the same stale air, suffering the same vermin and disease. They were allies, but also dangers, lifelines entwined with chains. In the gilded prison of the Forbidden City, survival was never solitary, but always bound to others who carried the same filth on their hands. The Forbidden City was a palace of rituals. Every season, every celestial alignment, every imperial anniversary was marked with ceremonies meant to project harmony, abundance, and divine order. Drums thundered across the courtyards, bells rang like echoes from heaven, and officials in embroidered robes lined up in perfect rows, their movements choreographed as if the empire itself danced to a sacred rhythm. To outsiders, these festivals were dazzling, proof that the Son of Heaven ruled a world untouched by chaos. But to the women of the harem, who stood behind painted screens or sat rigid in their designated rows, these spectacles were less divine than they appeared. Beneath the layers of gold and ritual, rot lingered, hidden yet undeniable. Preparations began days in advance. Courtyards were swept, incense burned in vast quantities, and lanterns polished until they gleamed. Eunuchs scurried like ants, shouting orders, while maids carried trays of silks, flowers, and ritual objects. Concubines were dressed in layers of embroidered robes, their hair coiled into elaborate shapes, pinned with jade and pearl. At first, the young concubine felt a thrill at these transformations. She looked in the mirror and saw not a weary prisoner, but a radiant figure, glowing in silk and gold. Yet beneath the finery, her skin itched from unwashed robes, her scalp burned from tight hairpins, and her stomach churned from stale rice. She knew the illusion could not last. On the morning of a great festival, the harem assembled in their designated courtyard. The air was thick with incense, so heavy it masked the familiar odors of waste and mildew. Musicians plucked zithers and beat drums, their melodies floating above the noise of rustling robes and shuffling sandals. Officials prostrated themselves before the emperor, who sat high upon his dragon throne, a figure at once distant and suffocating. The women bowed low, their foreheads pressed to cold stone, the weight of their robes pressing heavily on their backs. From afar, the scene was magnificent, but up close, the concubine could see the sweat running down painted faces, the trembling of women struggling to hold their bows, the faint smell of unwashed bodies hidden beneath perfumes. The festivals were not for the concubines, they were for appearances. Their role was to embody harmony, to present beauty as evidence of order. Yet hunger gnawed at their bellies, lice crawled beneath their collars, and sores burned on their skin as they knelt in the sun. Hours passed in rigid postures, knees aching, mouths dry, while eunuchs barked corrections at the slightest deviation. A fainting woman was carried away in silence, her disgrace noted by all. Those who endured were praised for their composure, but in truth they were simply survivors of another day's humiliation. Feasts followed the ceremonies, but even here, the illusion of abundance concealed decay. Tables groaned under the weight of dishes, steamed buns, glazed meats, candied fruits, rare teas, but most of it was reserved for the emperor and his highest officials. The concubines sampled only scraps, their portions small, their hunger never fully satisfied. Much of the food, untouched after hours of ritual, spoiled quickly in the summer heat, swarmed with flies before it could be cleared. Servants carried it away in buckets, some sold in secret markets, some fed to animals, much simply discarded. To the concubines, the sight was bitter, luxury so abundant it rotted in front of them, while they returned to quarters where rice came stale and vegetables wilted. The festivals also carried risks. Rivalries sharpened in the heightened visibility. A misplaced glance at the emperor, a robe judged too fine, a bow held too long. Any of these could be twisted into accusations. Women whispered about one another even as they knelt side by side, smiles fixed, eyes lowered. A festival meant spectacle, but it also meant scrutiny, and scrutiny in the harem was always dangerous. The young concubine began to see the festivals less as moments of splendor and more as mirrors of the palace itself, dazzling on the surface, decayed beneath. The golden banners could not hide the rats that scurried behind storerooms. The scent of sandalwood could not erase the stench of chamber pots. The emperor's throne gleamed, but his courtyards teemed with vermin and disease. The festivals were plays, staged with precision, but like all plays, they ended. The curtains drawn, the audience gone, leaving behind only sweat, exhaustion, and silence. At night, after a day of ceremony, the concubine returned to her chamber, her hair unpinned, her robes folded away. Her body ached from hours of kneeling, her skin raw beneath layers of powder, her stomach empty. She lay on her thin bedding and thought of the contradiction she had just endured, that she had been dressed as a goddess while feeling like a beggar, that she had embodied the empire's harmony while enduring its filth. The contradiction was the essence of palace life, and the festivals simply magnified it until it became impossible to ignore. For the world outside, the forbidden city remained a symbol of perfection. For the women within, it was a theater of gilded rot. The festivals, with all their music, banners, and incense, were not escapes from filth, but elaborate disguises for it. They reminded the concubines that their lives were performances, that every smile, every bow, every breath was part of a play staged for others. Beneath the performance lay sores, hunger, vermin, and despair. Beneath the golden banners lay rot. In the harem, everything depended on favor. A single glance from the emperor could raise a woman from obscurity to power, surround her with silks and attendants, and make her family proud beyond measure. But just as swiftly, that same favor could vanish, leaving her forgotten in a chamber where dust gathered on the windows and silence pressed like a shroud. To fall from favor was to lose not only comfort, but identity. It was a descent into invisibility, A living death endured within walls that no longer remembered her name. At first, the fall was subtle. The summons to the emperor's chamber grew less frequent. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months, until the concubine realized that her name had not been spoken in the ledgers for an entire season. She still dressed each morning, still powdered her face, still waited for the eunuch's call, but the call never came. Her robes grew older, her meals smaller, her attendants fewer. She became a ghost of the harem, present yet unseen, her beauty fading while younger women were brought in to replace her. The humiliation of neglect was sharpest in small details. A favored woman received gifts, silks, jewels, fruits sent from distant provinces. A forgotten one received nothing. Where once her chamber had echoed with laughter and footsteps, now it lay silent, the emptiness broken only by the scuttle of rats or the cough of her maid. Even the servants began to treat her differently, their deference cooling, their obedience tinged with impatience. They whispered among themselves, certain that her days of importance were over, and in their whispers she heard the truth. She no longer mattered. Rivals, too, sharpened their cruelty. Once, when she had been favored, they had smiled at her, offered her false compliments, bowed to her rising rank. Now they ignored her, or worse, mocked her in whispers. They relished her decline, for in the harem, another woman's fall meant one less rival to fear. The concubine learned quickly that friendship in the palace was conditional, dissolving as swiftly as favor itself. Alone in her chamber, she tasted the bitterness of betrayal more keenly than the hunger in her belly. Obscurity carried with it filth of another kind. Her chamber was no longer cleaned with care. The incense provided grew sparse, the perfumes rationed, the basins of water fewer. Mold crept along the walls unchecked. Bedding, once replaced frequently, grew thin and lice-ridden. Meals, already poor, arrived late and colder than before, their trays carried by eunuchs who barely acknowledged her existence. The illusion of refinement vanished entirely. She realized with despair that her rank had shielded her not only with privilege, but with cleanliness. Stripped of it, she was left to filth as raw and humiliating as that endured by the lowest servant. The fall from favor also meant the death of dreams. She had once hoped to bear a son, to rise through the ranks, to secure her place in history. Now those hopes withered. The emperor would not summon her. Without his attention, she would never conceive, never rise, never matter again. She was trapped in the palace until death, condemned to fade in silence while others took her place. It was not a quick death, but a slow erosion of spirit, each day pressing her further into despair. The cruelty of the system lay in its permanence. She could not leave, could not return to her family, could not begin anew. She belonged to the harem until her body failed. Even in neglect, she remained a prisoner, chained not by iron but by invisibility. The walls around her were the same walls that had once gleamed with promise, but now they closed in, suffocating her with their silence. She understood finally that the palace was not only a prison of grandeur, but a machine that consumed women, using them until their beauty faded, then discarding them like wilted flowers. At night, lying on her bedding, she thought of the girls who still waited eagerly for the summons she no longer received. She pitied them, envied them, and despised them all at once. They did not yet know what she knew, that the emperor's glance was not a gift but a curse, that favor was fleeting, and that obscurity awaited them all eventually. The palace was not a place of eternal glory, but of cycles, and every cycle ended in the same silence. Yet even in her despair, she clung to fragments of dignity. She combed her hair each morning, arranged her robes as best she could, and bowed with composure when passing others. If she was to be forgotten, she refused to be forgotten in disgrace. Her dignity became her rebellion, her small defiance against a system that reduced her to nothing. It was fragile, but it was hers. The fall from favor was the fate of most concubines, and yet it remained the most unspoken truth of the harem. Paintings never showed the forgotten women in their moldy chambers, their eyes hollow, their robes frayed. Histories rarely named them. They vanished not only from the emperor's sight, but from memory itself. Only within the palace walls did their ghosts linger, reminders of a truth too shameful to be recorded, that the gilded harem was not filled with goddesses, but with women discarded like broken ornaments, left to rot in silence. For the young concubine, this truth was almost unbearable. She had dreamed of splendor, endured filth, and now faced the worst cruelty of all, obscurity. She lived, but she no longer existed. She breathed, but she was no longer seen. The palace had taken her body, her youth, her hope, and left her with only silence. And in that silence, she realized the harshest truth of the Forbidden City, that to fall from favor was not only to lose the emperor's notice, but to lose herself. The Forbidden City was a place of smells as much as sights. Its red walls and golden roofs dazzled the eyes, but for those who lived inside, the air itself carried the truest story. Incense curled in endless streams from bronze censers, sandalwood perfumed corridors, jasmine blossoms floated in basins of water. Yet beneath these fragrances lingered odors less divine, the stench of chamber pots, the mildew of damp walls, the sourness of spoiled food. The palace was never truly clean, and so perfumes became more than adornment. They were masks, veils drawn over decay, fragile illusions meant to convince the women that their world was one of beauty rather than rot. The harem relied on scent to survive. Each morning maids lit sticks of incense, their smoke drifting lazily through chambers, mingling with dust and damp air. Concubines dabbed rose oil on their wrists, sandalwood on their collars, musk on their hair. Robes were hung over censers to absorb fragrance, masking the smell of sweat and mildew. Even chamber pots were disguised with sprigs of mint or petals of chrysanthemum, their sweetness mixing grotesquely with human waste. The palace smelled not of purity, but of contradiction, a blend of flowers and filth, incense and rot. Perfume was also a weapon. A concubine summoned to the emperor's chamber perfumed herself carefully, choosing scents thought to entice. Jasmine was believed to inspire tenderness, sandalwood to calm, musk to inflame desire. The young concubine watched older women argue over the merits of each fragrance, trading recipes whispered by maids, bribing eunuchs for rare oils imported from distant lands. A single vial of ambergris could secure advantage, its exotic scent marking a woman as rare, desirable, unforgettable. Yet perfume could not conceal everything. Beneath the sweetness, the emperor might still smell the truth of the palace. The mildew on robes, the sourness of unwashed skin, the faint odor of illness hidden under powder. Flowers, too, were woven into the illusion. Courtyards were filled with peonies, lotuses, chrysanthemums, their blooms carefully arranged by gardeners who understood the symbolism of each petal. Bouquets adorned chambers, floating in basins of water, masking the stench of stagnant air. Yet flowers wilted quickly in the dampness, their petals browning, their water turning foul. Attendants rushed to replace them, but the concubines knew the truth. Beauty in the palace was always fleeting, always rotting, always on the verge of collapse. For the young concubine, scents became both comfort and torment. She dabbed rose oil on her wrist to feel human again, to remember that she was once a girl in a village where gardens bloomed freely. Yet she also gagged at the sweetness that clung to chamber pots, the heavy incense that mixed with sickness, the perfume so strong it made her head ache. She realized that every fragrance in the palace was not a sign of refinement, but a disguise, a mask meant to hide what no one dared to admit, that the harem reeked of filth. The psychological weight of scent was immense. Smell has a way of searing memory more sharply than sight. Years later, women who survived the harem would recall not the gleam of golden tiles, but the stench of mildew, not the shimmer of silk, but the heavy sweetness of rancid oils. The palace branded itself upon their senses, leaving behind ghosts of fragrance that lingered long after they left. The concubine sometimes woke at night, choking on the imagined scent of incense mixed with waste, her dreams haunted not by images, but by odors. Perfumes were expensive, imported at great cost from across the empire. Civet musk from southern forests, sandalwood from distant India, ambergris carried across seas. These treasures arrived in tiny vials, guarded carefully, distributed sparingly. Favored women received them as gifts, their chambers perfumed richly. The rest made do with cheaper oils, often rancid, their sweetness turned sour. The inequality of scent mirrored the inequality of rank. Some women drifted in clouds of fragrance, others reeked of sweat beneath thin disguises. Yet even the richest perfumes could not erase the reality of filth. The palace remained damp, its drains poor, its vermin plentiful. Incense masked mildew but did not cure it. Flowers hid waste but did not remove it. Perfumes sweetened intimacy but did not erase the humiliation of coercion. The scents were masks, fragile and temporary, fading as quickly as the petals of chrysanthemums in autumn. When the smoke cleared, when the oils faded, when the flowers withered, the truth returned. The palace stank, and its women endured that stench in silence. For the young concubine, this truth was almost unbearable. She longed for the smell of her village, fresh earth after rain, firewood burning cleanly, rice steaming on the hearth. Those scents had been simple, honest, and untainted by deceit. Here, every fragrance was a lie, every flower a disguise, every perfume a mask. She realized that the greatest filth of the palace was not only what she saw or touched, but what she breathed each day. At dawn, when incense burned anew and flowers were replaced, she sometimes closed her eyes and pretended. She inhaled jasmine as if it were the fragrance of freedom, sandalwood as if it were the smell of safety. For a brief moment, she could believe the illusion, but the illusion never lasted. The chamber pot waited behind its screen. The mildew crept along the walls. The perfume faded, and with it, the dream. Thus, the Forbidden City became a place defined by lingering scents. Scents that promised beauty, but delivered only masks. To the world outside, the palace smelled of refinement. To the women within, it smelled of contradiction, of sweetness overwrought, of flowers covering decay. And in that lingering scent lay the essence of the harem's filth. A life lived behind veils, where even the air they breathed was a lie. Among the countless women who passed through the harem, most were forgotten, their names erased, their lives dissolved into silence. Yet history remembers a few, and among them none more than the formidable Empress Dowager Cixi. To later generations, she became a symbol of intrigue and dominance, the woman who bent the empire itself to her will. But what is often overlooked is where she began. Not as a goddess born to power, but as a concubine in the same filth as all the others, subject to the same indignities of lice, chamber pots, spoiled food, and endless waiting. Her story was not an escape from filth, but a triumph carved through it, an exception that proved how extraordinary one had to be to rise at all. Cixi entered the harem as a low-ranking concubine during the reign of the Xianfeng Emperor. She was one among many, dressed in embroidered robes that looked grand but smelled faintly of mildew, eating meals that were already cooling by the time they reached her, enduring the same daily humiliations behind painted screens. At first, her life was indistinguishable from the hundreds of other women who lingered in silence, waiting for a summons that might never come. But unlike many of her companions, she refused to resign herself to obscurity. Her advantage lay not in extraordinary beauty, though she was considered attractive, but in her keen intelligence and careful observation. Where others despaired, she studied. She watched the eunuchs, noting which ones could be bribed. She listened to whispers, remembering which women quarreled, which alliances formed, which favors shifted. She understood quickly that the harem was not only about pleasing the emperor, but about navigating the currents of power that flowed invisibly through its corridors. The filth around her, the vermin, the stench, the decay, was something she endured, but also something she used. She masked the reality with perfume, masked her thoughts with silence, and masked her ambitions with obedience. When the emperor summoned her, she was ready. Unlike many concubines who trembled with fear or numbed themselves with resignation, she met him with composure. She did not chatter, nor did she remain entirely mute. She chose her words carefully, offering him a sense of calm and wit. It was this balance, not mere physical beauty, that drew his notice. Soon she bore him a son, a child whose existence transformed her rank. In the harem, motherhood was the surest path to power, and Sixi grasped that path with both hands. But even motherhood did not lift her entirely out of filth. She still endured the lice in her bedding, the mildew in her chambers, the endless suspicion of rivals. Her rise did not erase these realities. It only gave her more tools to fight within them. When other women mocked or whispered, she outmaneuvered them. When eunuchs withheld supplies, she bribed them cleverly, offering trinkets less costly than the favor she gained. She learned that filth was not an accident, but a weapon, that those who controlled food, perfume, or water controlled life itself in the palace. And so she made allies of those who carried buckets and basins, securing loyalty from the very people her rivals ignored. Her true ascent came not in the harem alone, but in the collapse of the emperor's health. When the Xianfeng emperor died, leaving behind a young heir, Sixi maneuvered herself into the role of Empress Dowager, sharing regency with another widow. From that moment, she stepped beyond the confines of the harem into the governance of the empire itself. Yet even then, she carried the lessons of filth with her. She had endured the humiliation of spoiled food, the indignity of chamber pots, the endless whispers of rivals. These experiences hardened her, teaching her that survival required not purity, but cunning, not refinement, but resilience. Sixi became a figure both feared and admired, ruling from behind the curtain, shaping the fate of the Qing dynasty. But her rise should not be mistaken as proof that the harem was a place of opportunity. She was the exception that highlighted the cruelty of the rule. For every Sixi who clawed her way upward, hundreds of others languished in obscurity, their lives dissolved into mildew and silence. The palace produced not greatness, but waste, consuming women until they were broken, forgotten, or buried. The young concubine, hearing whispers of Sixi's ascent, might have felt a flicker of hope. Perhaps she thought she too could rise, if only she played her part carefully enough. But she also understood the truth, that the path was not open to all, that for every woman who bore a son and outmaneuvered her rivals, countless others faded without trace. Sixi's story was inspiring, but it was also a cruel reminder that the harem was not designed for triumph, but for decay. At night, lying on her thin bedding, the concubine thought of Sixi. She imagined the power of ruling from behind a screen, commanding ministers, shaping armies, directing the fate of a vast empire. Yet she also thought of the filth that had shaped her, of the lice, the mildew, the spoiled food, the chamber pots. Power had not freed her from filth. It had only taught her how to use it. The palace did not produce goddesses. It produced survivors, some forgotten, some remembered, all shaped by the same hidden filth. Thus, the story of Sixi revealed the darkest truth of all, that even the greatest triumphs of the harem were born from squalor. Power did not erase decay, it grew from it, nourished by the very filth that humiliated lesser women. The forbidden city, with all its golden roofs, was not a cradle of refinement, but a crucible of endurance. And only those who mastered filth rather than fled from it, could hope to rise. The Forbidden City loomed as the heart of empire, its golden roofs a symbol of eternity, its vermilion walls a fortress against time. Yet within those walls, the women of the harem lived lives that were anything but eternal. They entered as girls, clothed in silks that hid their trembling bodies, promised splendor, but delivered filth. They endured lice in their hair, mildew in their chambers, spoiled food in their bowls, and humiliation in their routines. Some bore sons and rose briefly in favor. Others, like Sixi, wielded power from behind screens, bending ministers to their will. But most did not rise. Most faded into silence. Their names were never recorded, their faces never painted, their voices never heard. They became the forgotten women buried not in earth alone, but in obscurity itself. The harem consumed them slowly. Youth gave way to age, beauty to wrinkles, hope to despair. Those who never bore children drifted to the margins, living out their days in cramped quarters, their robes frayed, their attendants few. They prayed, embroidered, or simply stared into the distance, waiting for a summons that never came. Some grew bitter, their words sharp, their eyes cold. Others grew numb, their voices quiet, their movements automatic. And when death finally came, whether from illness, neglect, or age, the palace received it with indifference. The body was carried away, the chamber reassigned, the name forgotten. Burial in the harem carried no grandeur. High-ranking consorts might receive tombs near the emperor, their names carved in stone, their spirits honored with rituals. But the lesser concubines, who had once been dressed in silks and perfumed with oils, were buried in mass graves outside the palace walls. Their identities dissolved, their bones mingling with one another, their stories erased. The world remembered them only as numbers. How many were chosen? How many bore sons? How many died? The rest, their laughter, their sorrow, their quiet endurance, vanished into silence. The young concubine, lying awake in her damp chamber, sometimes thought of this end. She imagined her body carried away in a plain wooden box, her name unspoken, her life reduced to whispers that faded before dawn. She thought of the river near her village, the way it had sparkled in sunlight, the way her laughter had once carried across its waters. No one in the palace knew that laughter, and no one would remember it when she was gone. Her life, which had once been hers, now belonged entirely to silence. The greatest cruelty of the harem was not its lice, its filth, or its hunger. It was its erasure. It devoured not only bodies but histories, reducing women to shadows behind painted screens. Their individuality dissolved into the machinery of empire. To the world outside, the palace seemed eternal. But within, each woman was temporary, replaceable, forgettable. The golden roofs endured. The vermilion walls endured. The women did not. And yet there is something haunting in that silence. The palace, for all its grandeur, cannot fully erase the truth of their suffering. The mildew that clung to their chambers, the stench that lingered in their air, the filth that marked their days, all of it leaves a trace. Even centuries later, when tourists wander through the Forbidden City, they may catch a faint whiff of dampness in the air, a faint echo of whispers in the halls. The silence speaks, if one listens closely. It tells of forgotten women who endured humiliation behind gold-painted gates, who lived in filth while the world imagined them as goddesses. The concubines of China's imperial court were not the shimmering figures of legend. They were human, aching, longing, suffering. Their lives were wrapped in illusions, but the illusions could not disguise the truth forever. Beneath the perfume lay stench. Beneath the silks lay sores. Beneath the festivals lay rot. And beneath the golden roofs of empire lay graves filled with silence. For the young concubine whose story has carried us through these chapters, the palace was never truly her home. It was her prison, her stage, her battlefield, and her grave. She entered with hope, endured with despair, and left only in silence. Her name is lost to history, but her story is shared by countless others who endured the same fate. Together, they form the hidden chorus of the Forbidden City, their voices stifled, their lives erased, their truths buried beneath centuries of illusion. The golden roofs of the Forbidden City still gleam in the sunlight, but for those who listen carefully, the wind that moves through its courtyards carries more than history. It carries the sighs of forgotten women, the faint rustle of robes worn thin, the echoes of laughter silenced too soon. And in that wind lingers the truest story of the harem, not one of splendor, but one of filth, despair, and silence that endures long after memory fades.